Dave Parody of FinancialViz.com and ThinkOutsideTheSlide.com. When you've done the analysis of your income or profit and loss statement, you want to look at the expenses. Maybe one of the messages you want to show is how the different areas or components add up to the total expenses. I would suggest you consider using a steps to a total bar chart to show those components visually. Here's typically what we get from analyzing our expense areas. We've got each of our areas as well as the amounts. This example comes from property company. And they all add up to the total. So that's basic information that we've looked at about the expenses. So when we want to turn it into a really meaningful visual, we need to prepare the data for the graph. So there's a few things that we want to look at in this table of data that we're going to use in the graph. First thing is, I've added a spacer segment. So that's the first column of numbers there. That spacer segment is going to be invisible in the graph, and what it does is it allows us to position the visible amount, which is the expense amount, those segments in the graph, because we're going to use a stacked bar graph, and to make a segment float, quote unquote float, over to the side, we need a spacer segment to position it there. I've made sure to include the total category in the graph data so that we have a total expense bar at the bottom of the graph so we can see how the total looks compared to each of the segments. The third series that I've added there is a series for the segment labels. What I like to do in bar graphs is to place the data label outside of the bar. Now that works in a regular bar chart, but it will not work in a stacked bar chart. A stacked bar chart only allows you to place labels inside the segment, which makes a lot of sense because that's what the label applies to. Well, what I want to do is to place it outside. So what I've done is I'm going to add an invisible segment, the label 1 segment data series here, that will allow me to position the label outside. And this uses a feature of Excel 2013 or above that allows you to have a data label from a different set of cells. So the visual that we create looks like this. It is a stacked bar chart, and you can see how visually it's easy to see how big each of these expense areas are compared to the total expense at the bottom. So some notes here about creating the visual in Excel. First of all, in a bar chart we clean up the default graph. The order of the bars in the default bar graph is reversed, so we have to just reverse those categories. Remove things like the title, legend, grid line, and axes lines, and measurement axes numbers that aren't adding to the understanding for the audience, but allow, when we clean them up, it allows the audience to focus on the actual data, which is the message we're trying to communicate. The bars in a default bar graph are not wide enough, so I make them wider, and I made that bar for the total a slightly different color, slightly darker shade of the blue to separate it from each of the segments visually. The segments that are for the spacer and for that label, I've set them to be invisible. Now, to do that, we just simply set the color of the fill color to no fill and then the outline to no line. So that's how we get it to essentially disappear. The segment is still there and positioning the other information where we want it to be. I've added the data labels outside of the bars. Now, the way I did that was I added the data labels to that label segment, which is invisible, at the base position. So that means it's going to be right beside the previous bar segment. And I've used the values from the expense amount data series. So I have the correct value in the label. It's just actually technically in a separate segment. So it's one of the tricks you can use to position a label where you want it to be in a stacked bar chart. And this way, the audience can easily see which of those segments is the largest and the values that are associated with each of those segments. So when your message is where you want the audience to see the components that add up to the total expenses, then the visual I suggest you consider using is a steps to a total bar chart. And the example we used here shows us visually that one of those segments is much larger than the others, and this allows us to now have that discussion with the audience that we want to have. For more examples of financial visuals that can effectively communicate the messages in financial results or analysis, go to FinancialViz.com or ThinkOutsideTheSlide.com.